Thank you for joining us on another episode of Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, the historian with Heritage Mississauga. Each week, we offer a chance for you to send in your questions, things you might be curious about and always wondered about the story behind. And we look forward to exploring the history of the city of Mississauga with you. So please send in your questions and let's have some fun discovering and exploring the history of here. Thank you. Our first question this week on Ask a Historian is from Susan, and she's asking about the connections to her own family history, and the ancestors that once lived within what is now Mississauga. The Gable family and through marriage the Hammond family were long entrenched in the community, what we know today as Clarkson. Although not the first family to receive, or first individuals to receive, a land grant in historic Mississauga, there is some evidence to suggest that they were the first ones on the ground. That is, the first people to begin to establish a home for themselves. Henry Gable, your ancestor Susan, arrived in Upper Canada sometime in 1798 or 1799, and seems from the evidence to have first settled in the Ancaster area of what is now Ontario. They originate from Pennsylvania. You probably know that in your own research. He received a land grant. Henry Gable Sr. Received a land grant in historic Mississauga on December 19th of 1807, and you were asking specifically the location of that. I'll show you a map as we go with this answer as well, but roughly the land itself stretched between what is now Royal Windsor Drive and Lakeshore Road, abutting Winston Churchill Boulevard. So to give you kind of the proximity there, he had 200 acres on the north side of Lakeshore Road running all the way to Winston Churchill, and an additional 30 acres on the south side of Lakeshore Road running down to Lake Ontario, what was known then as a broken front. We do believe, although he received his land grant in December of 1807, it's very unlikely they would have tried to come out to their property in the winter months. Roads were not in place. Very little for them to be able to survive in the early winter months of late 1807. However, very likely that he's on the ground making improvements to his property, starting to clear land, and ultimately building a house for his family starting in the spring of 1808. And so that's the kind of the date that we give for really the first concerted wave of actual land clearing and fence building and road improvements, etc. Henry Gable truly amongst the first to settle in this community. The log cabin that they built, again reportedly by the summer of 1808, they had a log cabin by measuring 22 by 18 feet. Pretty standard size for a log cabin of its time. The property legally that they acquired was known as Lot 35, Concessions 3 and 4, south of Dundas Street. And together, Henry Sr. and his wife Elizabeth, they had 7 children: John, Henry Jr., Jacob, Samuel, Magdalene, Elizabeth, and Catherine. And 2 of the sons, Henry Jr. and Jacob, both served in the War of 1812 with the local militia regiment. So we have some history connecting to them, as well as service records and the like. The Henry Jr., the son of Henry Sr., he received the north half of his property from his father in 1817, and he built a substantial frame house, Loyalist-style frame house, between 1817 and 1820. And it's this house, built by the next generation, by Henry Jr., that we come to know as the Gable Hammond House. His brothers, Henry Jr.'s brothers, Jacob and Samuel, were also granted property from their father, so it severed up the acreage quite early on in its story. The house and property of Henry Gable Jr. was located on what is today the south side of Royal Windsor Drive, formerly known as Highway 122, and immediately on the east side of Winston Churchill Boulevard, so just a little bit south of Royal Windsor Drive. Henry Jr.'s daughter, Lucinda, married David Hammond of Sheridan, and Hammond becomes quite a well-known individual within the community. And it's through this marriage that the Gables and the Hammonds become interconnected. David Hammond became really a backbone within the community community, successful farmer and fruit grower, trustee for the local school section number 5, trustee for Carmen Methodist Church, a trustee for the Palermo and Oakville Methodist Church Circuit, and also a justice of the peace. So quite a well-known individual in local terms. And through other intermarriages with the Gables and other families, they become related to the Outridge, Shook, and Speck families, all names that resonate in local Clarkson history. As for the old house itself, you might be curious where it was. It didn't stay in the same location. The Gable and Hammond families owned the property until 1930, at which time the property had left the family, as did the house. The house was moved. It was purchased by Sheridan Nurseries, and it was moved across the street, kind of kitty corner to the intersection, and relocated to the northwest side of northwest corner of Winston Churchill and Royal Windsor Drive. And the house was used for a boarding house and also for a time for housing for Japanese Canadian workers with Sheridan Nurseries during the Second World War. And we could talk about that movement of Japanese Canadians in the War Measures Act at another time. The new location of the house again was at Winston Churchill, the northwest corner of Winston Churchill and Royal Windsor. Unfortunately, the house suffered a fire. It was thought to have succumbed to vandalism in the late 1960s and was finally demolished in 1970. So, although we do have connections, known connections to the Gable and Hammond families, and we know of the house, and we have pictures of the house and the like, you can visit Spring Creek Cemetery on Clarkson Road. You'll see a number of Gables buried therein. They are a family we connect with historically within the stories of Clarkson and wider Mississauga. We aren't aware of living descendants of the family living within the bounds of the city today. We could be wrong. We'd love to find more information. We'd love to find more pictures. But we do have a little bit that ties to this early settling family and the story. Again, likely Henry Gable Sr. being the first on the ground in terms of making improvements on property in the spring of 1808. So thank you for your question, and we look forward to exploring more local history with you. Take care. So our next question on Ask a Historian is from Liz, and Liz is asking about the name origin for Quinnipiac Meadows Community Park, or affectionately known or locally known as Q Park. And the name of the park certainly has an Indigenous connection in terms of its name origin, but in terms of the selection of the name itself, we're not really sure how the name was picked. The park came to be in the 1970s when the area around this part of Erin Mills was developed and a parkland was set aside. Running through the park, however, is a creek known as Wabakane Creek, and the creek itself was named earlier. We know that the name was applied in the 1920s, and Wabakane takes its name from an Indigenous chief of the Mississaugas at the Credit River, one of the signatories of Provisional Treaty 13A and the Head of the Lake Treaty, Treaty 14, which was signed in 1806. So Wabakane is one of the chiefs who is a signatory to those treaties. Also, one of the signatories of the treaties is Chief Quinnipiac. So we assume that given the earlier name association to the creek, that might play some influence into selecting the name for the park that was developed in the 1970s. So joining me today to speak a little bit about the history of the name Quinnipiac and the individual himself, I'm very thrilled and pleased to be joined by Darin Wybenga from Mississauga Credit First Nation. Darin is traditional knowledge and sorry, Darin, I'm stumbling over my words here. Traditional knowledge keeper and land use coordinator and librarian for at New Credit. So thank you, Darin, for joining me, and thrilled to have you share your knowledge and your information on the name origin for Quinnipiac within our community. So thank you very much, and take it away.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Matthew. It's good to be here and try and answer this question. And the strange thing about Quinnipiac least I think it's strange, maybe it's not so strange, is the variations in his name. I'm used to calling him Quinnipinnau and instead of Quinnipinon, but I get what you're saying. I think if you look in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, I think there's 4 variations of this man's name, but his English name is Golden Eagle. That's what he's known by in English. And he's the principal chief of the Mississaugas at 12 Mile Creek. I think the name for it nowadays is Bronte Creek, if I remember correctly. He's the principal chief there, and he plays an important role, as you've mentioned earlier, in negotiating some of the treaties with the crown. He was well respected by his people. He's an elderly man now, at least that's what we assume. He's an elderly man at this time. So he's really the spokesman for the Mississaugas for those 2 treaty negotiations. We know he's involved in the Toronto Purchase Treaty of 1805. I think it was August 1st, 1805, the Toronto Purchase Treaty. Then the day after, they negotiated Treaty 13A, which later becomes Treaty 14. But during those negotiations, Quinnipinon acted as the spokesman for the chiefs and the people. And he was a pretty able spokesman. He basically had to tell the British at the time, you're not being fair with our people. We've given you land many times, you've asked for it, we've given it, but we haven't always received the benefits you promised us. Help from the farmers. We'd be able to live on our land as we always did. And now we want to carry out our lifestyle as we did, and we can't do it. Everywhere we go, there's fences springing up, there's plowed fields, the trees are getting cut down. We can't camp anywhere because the farmers are angry and run us off. You know, they shoot our dogs. Anyway, he's a very brave man telling the British this, but it all kind of fell on deaf ears. Because Treaty 13A, he did agree to give that a strip of land about 6 miles back from the shoreline, from Etobicoke Creek, the eastern boundary of the Toronto Purchase. Pardon me, western boundary of the Toronto Purchase. Getting my geography all mixed up here. All the way over to the Brant Tract. So quite a substantial amount of land. I think it's about 70,000 acres of land that was given up for, I guess, what was it, 1,000 pounds, I believe it was. So it's really a pittance. And he's doing this, and the people really are dissatisfied with him. He's talking during the negotiations with the British that, okay, we're going to do this reluctantly because our young men and our women are saying, you know, kind of like we're courting trouble if we're doing this. And of course, the people were in trouble. By the time, well, Quinnipinon, he comes to a rather ignominious end in 1812. It's really quite sad and tragic, but well, anyway, as things happen in history, one thing gives way to another. But in any case, he's looking around. I'm sure he's reflecting on the state of his people. I've mentioned earlier, things aren't good for them. They can't move about, do the traditional things they've done on the land, the hunting, the fishing, the gathering, all that sort of thing. They're ridden by disease. Their traditional economy has collapsed. Their population is falling substantially. I think mid-1780s, they're at 500. By the time 1812 rolls around, we're probably looking below 300 people. So there's substantial drop in population among the Mississaugas. And as people are demoralized, and not to mention wars in the air, you know, War of 1812, the Americans and the British are going to go at it, and you know the Mississaugas, and let's face it, most First Nations people are not going to remain neutral in this conflict. They have a lot at stake. So Chief Golden Eagle is looking for a way to strengthen his people, to inspire them, to get them to push through these difficult times. And he wants to do that using the traditional ways of doing things. So he goes off by himself to fast, to pray, and he gets this dream of a spearhead. Now, which he interprets to mean that he would be invincible against an arrow, a tomahawk, or a musket ball. And so that's how he interprets that dream. And with that dream in mind, shortly thereafter, he gathers the Mississaugas together and is going to demonstrate to the people the power of this dream. And he's hoping that if he can demonstrate his invincibility, just as he survives, his people will be able to push forward and survive and take some inspiration from that as well. And so, in order to do the demonstration, he picks up an old tin pot and holds it in front of his face. He tells the people that because of the dream he had and the gift that's been bestowed on him in the dream, that he will be able to survive a bullet being fired at his face. This pot will catch it. Now, so he steps away from the people and asks the warrior to fire at his face. Sad to say, he's dead on the ground. His dream did not come true. Instead of inspiring these people, I'm certain he demoralized the people even more. And it was such a sad end to really a wise, respected leader. Quite a tragic end. But it really helped set the stage for the Mississaugas, who keep moving along, moving toward this brink of extinction is what everybody thinks. The Crown thinks it, the Mississaugas think it. So he's kind of, what do I say, like I said, he demoralized them. And it causes the Mississauga people to lose faith in some of their more traditional ways. And a sad thing when people start losing faith that way, because there's really an evaporation of hope. And so later on, of course, you find out, I'm sure people know, the Mississaugas change their lifestyle. They become Christians and they become farmers. And they do a good job of it at the mission village located on the Credit River. And basically they're inspired by the Reverend Peter Jones, himself a Mississauga of the Credit Chief, and Chief Joseph Sawyer. I won't even try and pronounce their Mississauga names. I won't even try that. But they really, that eroding of faith that I suppose accelerated after Chief Golden Eagle was killed, really led forward to that, the advancement of Christianity and the agrarian lifestyle. The Mississaugas realized they couldn't go on the way they were. The interesting thing about this, I find, we don't hear after Chief Golden Eagle's death, Quinnipinnon's death, we hear no more of him, but we do hear of his grandson. His grandson is born in 1815, so he's still just 3 years after his grandfather's death, and he moves into the mission village with most of the other Credit River people. And the great thing about this grandson, he's born 1815, he moves in about 1827. He's one of the first students in the mission school. And he takes like a duck to water to the new ways. He becomes a wonderful student. He's diligent, he's hardworking, all that stuff, and the village and Peter Jones look to him and admire him and think, boy, with the way this boy works, the First Nation is going to be in for a good future. That's the way of thinking. Now, the sad thing is, he dies a year later. 1828, I think he dies. He's only 12 years old. And he's laid out in his coffin. And this is what I think is kind of touching. His schoolmates, recognizing his zeal for education and his love for the new Christianity, this new religion that he's taken on, put his Bible on the coffin, his hymn book on the coffin, an Ojibwe hymn book, and they put his spelling book on the coffin as well. This grandson, was really, how do I say it, was really zealous for the new change that was coming about among the Mississauga people. So you have, I like this, you have the grandfather leaning toward the traditional ways, and he comes to a sorry end. And you have the grandson leaning toward the newer ways. He comes to a sad end too. But to me, it's a transition in there between the old ways and the new ways. I kind of wonder nowadays what it would be like if grandfather and grandson could get together and talk about how things have changed. I wonder what they'd think now. Would Chief Golden Eagle been upset with his grandson's movement toward Christianity and the education he was getting? Would the grandson Joseph, that was his name, Joseph, would his grandson Joseph be saying, "That was the old way, Gramps, you got to get with the new thing"? I kind of wonder. It's kind of amusing sometimes. And of course, I like to speculate about this stuff because I don't have other things to do. You sit around thinking, what would they think about the progress of the Mississaugas today? Because there's that whole story beyond the Credit River Mission and so on, and the progress that goes on there. So that's kind of what I know about Quinnipinon, Quinnipineau, the other name, Golden Eagle, whichever way you want to name him. That's kind of what I know about him, and I hope you've learned a little bit about the man.
That's fascinating. What strikes me about your and I tend to wander down those things of what ifs as well, and they may have approached the world differently, and as young Joseph. And did Joseph have a Christian surname at that point, or was there a family name?
Quinnipineau.
Oh, okay. So
yeah, just kind of like his grandfather, Quinipeno.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I wonder if they probably approached life with a similar zeal, and
that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Did the apple fall far from the tree? Both obviously men of faith, or people of faith, I should say, grandfather, boy. Yeah, both moving forward in their respective faiths.
Yeah.
And one, the leader of a Mississauga band. The other one, I think, had he lived,
right,
he would have certainly been something important to the society. Important to our society.
Does the surname Quinnipineau survive within the Mississaugas?
It does not. Matter of fact, after he dies, I have not seen any records within the mission village talking about those relatives.
Right.
And certainly not when we move from the mission village to the new credit, as we call it now.
Right.
No trace of those folks.
Yeah, I remember looking at early census records in Haldeman and looking at the family names, and your own ancestor Herkimer's name appears on some of those early records as well. But
right.
I hadn't come across Quinnipineau as a name, so that it certainly would seem like that line came to an end, which is sad. You were mentioning when we chatted before, we don't precisely know where Chief Quinnipinon or Chief Golden Eagle, where he met his demise in a geographic sense. We know the story of his demise, but not particularly where it took place. But he wasn't necessarily associated in his life with the Credit River itself, was he? Like
he probably been to it a number of times, because of course people of the head of the lake people, the Mississaugas at the head of the lake, would venture off to the Credit River from time to time, spring fishery, fall fishery, ceremonies, celebrations, so on. And that, it was always a time of gathering. So I'm sure he was at the Credit River, but at the Credit River mission,
right?
Not at all.
No,
not at all.
That was later. So the people, and I can just imagine, it must have shattered that community to lose a chief in the midst of a crisis already, war of existence in terms of faith, and to have a chief suddenly meet his demise in the midst of already troubling times. Must have shattered the psyche of those that traditionally followed him and believed him. What happened in a general sense? What happened to the people around the 12 Mile Creek itself? You mentioned some, I think, ended up at the Credit Mission with Peter Jones in time.
Eventually they did. A lot of the Mississaugas, Peter Jones was able to entice them to move to, I'm not sure if you're aware of a place called Davisville, just outside of Brantford.
Yeah.
It was a Christian mission station at that time.
Is that
run by the
is that Muncie? Is that Muncie?
No,
No?
this is called, it's called Davisville, named after I believe it was Mohawk Chief Davis of all things.
Okay.
And he used to have Christians gathered at his home, and so this whole little Christian settlement sprung up around his home, became known as Davisville.
Okay.
And Peter Jones actually worked there for a few years, and a number of the Mississaugas of the Credit actually ventured down. He enticed them to come to the Credit River and come to this Davisville where they could get the good religion and learn new things. So by the time 1825, 1826 rolls around, I think there's pretty much 200 band members that have converted to Christianity. And they form that nucleus that goes on to the Credit River Mission in 1826.
Yeah.
And that's what happens there. So for a while, it's sad to say, after Quinnipiac died, I can't speak for the people exactly at 12 Mile Creek. I think things just became worse and worse and worse. The population keeps declining. By the time 1820 rolls around, the Mississaugas at the head of the lake have a population of about 200.
Right.
So it shrank even more. I'm sure demoralization, and I think by the time the last treaties we had were signed, 1822, 1823, well, you know them for 12 Mile Creek, 16 Mile Creek, the Credit. We were just demoralized, and when they come to negotiate the treaties with us, Colonel Claus, the superintendent at the time, says, listen, we can give you enough goods to keep, and money, and to keep body and soul together for the next little while. And our chiefs are saying, yeah, okay, go ahead, because we won't have much use for the land anymore.
Yeah.
So there's this despair that settles in.
There was a term, I think, I can't remember the source of it, but saying that we will become a people of the past.
Yeah, something like that.
In a way, like I hadn't thought of it in these terms before, but the tragic death of Quinnipiac, it creates, in a sense, at least in my interpretation, almost a vacuum of direction. And you know, would it be too far reaching to say that Peter Jones steps into that vacuum? I know there's a gap in time there, but
well, I think definitely Peter Jones is the next big leader,
mm-hmm.
At least in terms of my mind anyway, that really inspires the people kind of as a whole and gets them moving together.
Right.
Between him and Joseph Sawyer anyway.
Yeah.
Joseph Sawyer Peter Jones was the missionary, and Joseph Sawyer was kind of the one that kept the village together,
yeah.
People moving along, and he was kind of, how do I say it, the village administrator? I don't know what you would call him.
I was going to say, he was the feet on the ground in the village.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He exactly was that. So, but after that, yeah, I don't know who followed after Golden Eagle. I just don't know who followed. If anybody, or did, and you know, Mississauga people were highly mobile.
Yeah.
Where did they go? Did they move? Did some move east, to move west?
I wonder if, and there may not be an answer for this, but you know, a good portion of our members are interested in genealogy and things like
right.
The idea of exploring your own family roots. I do wonder within the Mississaugas today if there are those that trace their ancestry back to the Otter clan and Quinnipiac's people at the 12 Mile Creek, and still connecting to that, you know, not the lineage of Quinnipiac, but certainly those people.
Right.
And
well, I think there probably are. I've never looked into the clans too much,
yeah.
But one of the things you've got to remember, the Mississaugas at the Credit that were usually encamped at the Credit were basically Eagle clan members. At least 25% of them were. 12 Mile Creek people were generally Otter people. And one thing I do know is that the two Eagles married Otters, so crazy as that sounds, quite a lot.
Okay.
There was a lot of intermarriage. So there's no doubt Otter clan blood still flowing in the Mississaugas of the credit here. But to actually go through and trace them all back to a strict Otter would be hard. And I think part of the problem is too, in our clan system, everybody, it's all matrilineal, patrilineal. It all goes through your father's line.
Yeah.
So if you break out of that family line, that father's line, all of a sudden you might find that your clan ends.
Right.
Which rather abruptly, I might add. And I think that's the way, for example, New Credit now, we don't have a lot of people that can identify with clans per se anymore. We still have Eagle Clan people. We still have a few Otters. We still have a few Bears.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, I found we even have a Birch Bark Clan member here.
Okay.
Which you never hear of too often. For a matter of fact, one of my ancestors was a Birch Bark Clan member, but it's not something you normally hear of. The whole clan thing is pretty complicated. And I think the other issue we have at New Credit is we've intermarried a lot with our neighbors, the Six Nations of the Grand. And so you have that interplay going on too, because they're a matrilineal people. And so now we have patrilineal and matrilineal, and some people, quite frankly, identify with their Six Nations clan more than they would. So it's a bit of a hodgepodge nowadays, clan membership. Though I'll point out, Peter Jones already, when he wrote his History of the Ojibwe Nation, was basically, and this is what, 1850 something that came out, was basically saying no one really pays attention to clan membership anymore anyway, is what he said. It kind of retired.
It's already diffused to a point. And
yeah, it was already going downhill, not being used. Though interesting, we have some treaty documents. Well, you've seen some of our treaty documents that still have the dotems on them.
Yeah.
And what you usually see is Eagle Clan and the Otter.
Yeah.
Usually that's what you see, not a plethora of others.
No, are there, out of curiosity, maybe we can close on this question. In Mississauga, whether on purpose or accidentally, we have a feature on our landscape in the name of this park that commemorates this early Indigenous chief, even if he didn't live in this geography at that point in time. Are there any other places where Quinnipinon is or Golden Eagle is remembered other than in the stories of the Mississaugas? Are there physical places on the landscape where he is, that you know of, that he has any remembrances?
You know what? I can't think of anything that we have ourselves that we would be cognizant of where he's been commemorated. And that's too bad in a way. We know we have the treaty documents, and that's really the reason we remember him. And we have to rely on historians to kind of tell us what some of the things that we forgot. I suppose it's kind of like the same thing with the Canadian prime ministers. The average Canadian don't know who the prime minister was 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways that's with us too. Our memories get a little dim with time. It was interesting enough. There was a school board a few years ago that was thinking of commemorating him in a scholarship or something.
Okay.
I think it was a scholarship. I don't even remember who the school board was. And I was asked about it, and I remember thinking, I don't know. Do we want to commemorate this chief? I think he was great and stuff, but people are going to see this sad story about a demoralized people and the sad ending to his life. And I couldn't but help wonder, maybe we should commemorate the young grandson.
That's what I was going to suggest as well.
That's what I got thinking. I don't know if I suggested. It's been a few years since we even talked about that, and I don't know what ever became of it.
Right.
I think in this day and age, it's pretty hard to know what to commemorate anymore. One people's hero might not necessarily be another's. That's what we're finding nowadays.
Very, very rarely at any point in history, and we see this with, and I don't want to go into the segue of what's happening elsewhere, but of commemorations in time, the interpretation of what that means changes with each generation, and they view things with different perspectives, and even
Oh,
Peter
for
Jones
sure.
has, Peter Jones is not it's a difficult story in portions to kind of wrap your head around the cultural change that took place during his time, and I'm sure from an outsider like myself looking in, I can see the time of Peter Jones and the transition that meant to a people
Yeah.
had to have been a difficult time in a spiritual, educational, cultural sense in a community. Never mind what it looks like today, looking back in the lens
Right.
of of, of Indigenous society today. Um, Impactful. Perhaps that's what we can say is these individuals were impactful uh,
Right.
and shaped the lives of people, and you could argue that every one of them probably did it to the best that they believed, given the circumstances they lived in.
Exactly. Exactly. There's even today, there's people here on the First Nation that see him as a dark force for breaking down traditions and culture. And there's other people, myself included, that think, thank goodness he came along and pulled us back from that brink of extinction. I
Right.
shouldn't say he pulled us back. We all pulled ourselves back.
Yeah.
But he's that catalyst that got us going. One of the interesting things, the people that find him so easy to condemn, where often do they get their notions of Mississauga culture from? His book, History of the Ojibwe Nation.
Yeah.
He did a lot to preserve our culture in that one book.
Well, and the translations that he made, even if they were teaching new things, were also about, I guess, connecting to the culture that was there and he was part of. And yeah,
Well, that's it.
very, very, very seldom is history ever a clear, clean cut. And
It's never black and white. I'm thinking about the Edgerton Ryerson statue
yep,
right now. He gets a bad rap out there nowadays
yep,
as he's viewed as the one of the founders of the residential school system.
yep,
But he was our first missionary at the Credit River,
yep.
and I don't think it's too. I was gonna say we adored the man. Maybe that's a little bit too strong, but we certainly didn't view him as some enemy of the people. Matter of fact, we saw him being a very positive person in our community.
And
So history's a funny thing.
it is, and we view Ryerson as one of the founders of the education system, and we could have a discussion another time on
Oh,
residential schools, and I would say in my own hindsight of what I've read and what I've learned from Peter Jones and Edgerton Ryerson, that uh, they would be abhorred with what happened in residential schools.
oh, for sure. I think they would have been horrified by it.
Yeah, that was never the intent.
Never, never.
Ryerson came under the direction of Peter Jones, developed, from my understanding with Donald Smith's book, a lifelong friendship with each other.
Oh, he spoke at Jones's funeral.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
a revered individual. And I don't know. I'll have to share this with you. I don't know if you've seen this or not, but where the Credit Mission Village site stood in the city of Mississauga today, we have a survey plan for when the road alignments were actually closed. And the two roads, there are two parallel roads within the village setting, and one was called Mississauga Road, which is the name that we carry today, Mississauga Road, and the other one was Ryerson Road.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I'll have to send that to you. So I mean,
That's wonderful.
you're dealing with a community that commemorated or at least connected with this individual who was an outsider, but
Right.
that devoted himself to at least a portion of his career to Reverend Peter Jones's work and the Credit Mission. So yeah, it's not clear cut, and maybe a discussion for another day.
Well, one of these days, yes.
Um,
Yes.
So one thing I'll wrap up on this just as a thought, and this is directed back at Liz, who asked the question about Quina Pennon. If you look at the city of Mississauga crest, the official crest, on the one side of the and I don't know if you've seen the crest at all, Darin, but on the one side of the crest is a Indigenous warrior holding 4 feathers in his hand.
Oh, yes.
And the four feathers represent the four chiefs who signed Provisional Treaty 13A and Treaty 14, one of whom, of course, is Quenipenon or Golden Eagle, the others being Okamapenes, also known as John Cameron, and Wabakane or Wabakaneen on pronunciation.
I know those names, yeah.
And the third one being Chichok or Chechalk.
Right.
And those are the four chiefs that are represented with those four feathers that are held in the on the Mississauga city crest on the Indigenous warrior's hand. Of those four chiefs, three of them have at least some name recognition on the modern landscape, although the two of them, Oka is a truncation of Okamapenes. It has a road name after him in a subdivision, not necessarily the most glamorous individual.
Right.
Named about the same time as the park at Quenipenon Meadows, or Q Park, as many residents call it today. Wabakane Creek, however, and subsequently Lake Wabakane, take their name much earlier, and we're not sure the origins of that. They date to the 1920s at least, and we don't know why the name or where it came from. But that name was on the landscape earlier, and these other names came about much later, but although in close proximity to Wabakane Creek. Chichok or Chechalk does not, and again, I don't have an answer as to why, or an answer as to if we should. But it is something worth noting that we do recognize, in at least a passive way, some connection in this landscape to Indigenous peoples who walked here long before the modern city has developed. And so that's, we'll sum up on that. Liz, thank you for your question. And Darin, truly thank you. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to walking down memory road with you again on the road. And we'll end on that. And thank you very much for your question for Ask a Historian. Okay, thank you for your question, Chris, on Ask a Historian. You're asking about archaeological sites around the city that you've heard or referenced, perhaps read about over time, and in particular, kind of the rules and regulations around that. But you had a specific question of what happens if remains are found, and the process for dealing with those. And I could probably give you some anecdotal stories around it, but rather than just directing you to some publications, I thought I'd reach out to someone who can talk with a great deal more knowledge about the subject. And a pleasure once again to welcome John Dunlop, who is the Manager of Heritage Planning and Indigenous Relations with the City of Mississauga, and himself, I don't know if I can't say former, I believe you are still an archaeologist, but a long career in archaeology as well. And so I welcome John Dunlop. And as we've noted in other conversations we've had on this program, there are a myriad of archaeological sites around Mississauga. We don't talk about them individually, and there are reasons behind that. But there is a rich and layered story to the city of Mississauga, and perhaps, John, you can introduce us to some of those. And again, the question revolving around sites in general, but what happens in the process of identifying a site and if there are remains found. It's just a fascinating topic. So thank you, John, for once again joining us and being willing to be on a show like this. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you very much for having me on. Yeah, I've been a practicing archaeologist, licensed archaeologist for a little over 20 years now. I started my career in the late 90s here in Ontario, and I've had the pleasure of excavating, give or take, around 1,000 sites across the province. And I've carried out probably well over 5,000 archaeological assessments or investigations, going from small building permits to large subdivisions. So, as you said, Mississauga has an incredible, rich archaeological resource, has a rich set of sites. There's over 300 sites that we know of, and an estimate of 20 to 25 get found and recorded annually. So there's more sites get found every single year. For folks that don't know, the Indigenous history, first of all, Indigenous history is not told through archaeology. It's told through those communities, through their own histories, and they have their own histories about where they came from. What we as archaeologists do is we identify the fact that the remains left by the ancestors of today's Indigenous people are important. The artifacts are important. They are cultural links to their past, and we seek to investigate them, and we use science. So when I'm talking today, I'm going to be talking from an archaeological perspective, but I want everyone to understand that that's not the overriding way of understanding Indigenous history. It's simply the way that that archaeologists look at it. So sites, we date sites based on how old they are, obviously. So for those that don't know, the glaciers rolled in, give or take, around 40,000 years ago, and they began to retreat 13,000 years ago. There's nothing recorded that predates those glaciers. That was during the last major ice age. But right after the glaciers started to leave, people started to move in. There were herds of caribou moving through, and Southern Ontario and Mississauga looked an awful lot like you would see up in the Arctic today. A pretty barren landscape, not a lot of soil, not a lot of vegetation of any kind, but people still figuring out how to live off of aquatic resources and off of herds of caribou and so forth moving around. So the archaeological term for that time period is Paleo-Indian. And that dates from about 13,000 years ago to about 9,000 years ago. At about 9,000 years ago, the weight of the glaciers having retreated, you know, when the weights lifted from those glaciers, it actually caused the ground to rise. So all the bedrock that had that pressure from the glaciers started to sort of bounce upwards, and it caused a shift in the way that the waters flow through the area. So the Credit River would have become a meandering creek. If you think about anything south of really Britannia Road, or even further north over by 16 Mile Creek, it's a very clay soil. And that's because that whole area for about 5,000 years was a big marshland. And Lake Ontario essentially dried up. The Niagara Falls stopped flowing altogether, and all the water from the northern parts of the province actually flowed out down the Montreal River and out towards the Atlantic Ocean that way. So you get this whole change in the way people at that time would have lived. They would have had to adapt to a completely different landscape. But there was also a gradual warming. So we start to get the plant and animal species that are more commonly found, you know, in Ontario that we think of today: deer, moose, bear, Carolinian forests, and so forth. So people had to adapt in order to live their new lifeways. Then again, about 5,000 years ago, the bedrock subsided and the land started to look more or less like it does today. Of course, there would have been long stretches of grassland and meadows and forests and so forth. Development, you know, and urban sprawl and so forth has really changed the landscape in some pretty profound ways. But you know, you get a very different landscape yet again, and Indigenous ancestors are constantly adapting to the new lifeways. You know, around 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, they begin to settle down and set up villages, and they start agriculture and horticulture and those types of practices. There are still groups that are moving around the landscape, living off the land more or less. They would gather together down around river mouths like the Credit, like 16 Mile Creek, in the spring and the summer when the fish were plentiful and the resources were there, and then they would disperse into smaller groups and go back across the landscape to shelter over the winter. And anywhere that these people lived, they left their remains. They left stone tools, they left pottery, they left stone implements. We don't get a lot of botanical or biological remains. The soils in Mississauga and in Southern Ontario are actually fairly acidic, so preservation of things like Vegetable remains or wood and so forth are pretty few and far between, unless you're going back maybe 1,000 years or so. Anything before that, it becomes a lot rarer to be able to find remains like that. But we do get a lot of stone tool remains. So those types of sites are very plentiful and extend pretty much across the entire city. Archaeologists look at a landscape, and as I said, you know, people live near water. Water is the primary thing. Everybody needs to live across the globe. So people will always congregate near water to live. And so typically you do find archaeological sites closer to water than further away. But when you consider the numerous creeks and streams and everything that flow through Mississauga, it actually gets really hard to get away from a water course. You're pretty much on water, or you're within a very short walk of water, no matter where you camp. So that's why you get archaeological sites across the entire city.
A well-watered landscape.
It is, absolutely. And that's why water is a very important cultural dynamic for Indigenous people. You know, it is sacred to them. It's highly important for them.
Are there you know, every culture has probably have its differences, but when it comes to water, were there areas that were traditionally you would look for spaces historically? I don't want to draw attention to a particular site, but did they, you know, east side, west side, high banks, above a swampy area for resources? Were there places that typically drew groups? I guess that's just a general question.
Yeah, that's. I mean, when the people were sort of smaller bands moving across the landscape, they'd be looking for some place that provided access to water, access to resources, and some shelter. As people started to move into villages and so forth, and start building, you know, small municipalities in and of themselves. We're talking, you know, 6 to 10 longhouses with a palisade with a big fence around the outside. They're looking for areas where they can clear fields to grow corn, to grow other supplements and other staples, and would still have access to water. The important thing to remember with water too is not only, you know, is it important for life and it has significant cultural importance, it was also their means of transportation. It was the only way that they could move quickly around this landscape, because before we get into systematic water management systems and development and grading and so forth, you think about trying to hike across parts of Ontario a little further north, and you can't walk 2 kilometers without having to cross multiple creeks and streams and climb over boulders, and it's actually a really impassable landscape. So they relied heavily on the rivers, on the lakes, to be able to move around. And so they wanted to live near where they traveled. It's no different than people that want to live near the 401 today.
Right. But you said part of the challenge with archaeology also was they left little behind. I think the term I've heard used is they live lightly on the landscape. They left, when you said stone tools, like I think what jumps to mind first and foremost would be arrowheads, but there's pounding stones and scrapers and the like. What, I guess, in a sense, how do you identify a site?
So that's a good question. It used to be, archaeology started in Ontario and in the Mississauga area by organizations. There were several archaeologists that were hired by the provincial government. And they would go out and sort of carry out systematic surveys. Then in the 1980s, things changed, and the province began to recognize that archaeology is a valuable resource. And so they enshrined the need to look for archaeology before development into legislation, such as the Ontario Heritage Act and the Ontario Planning Act. So starting in the early 1980s, it became a requirement to start checking for archaeological sites before any development goes through. And that's a requirement that's only increased over the years. By 1990, it was a requirement for most major developments like subdivisions and so forth. So what you then had was the growing of an industry called the cultural resource management or archaeological resource management industry. And these are trained archaeologists. I was a member of that industry myself. And we consult with developers. They would hire a team of archaeologists to come out and check a property that is scheduled for development before any construction actually occurs, and check to see if there's any sites there. And the way we do that is, if it's a plowed field, if it's a farm field, and you think of your classic, I mean, this was Mississauga, this is anywhere in Ontario really, farm fields become subdivisions is sort of the story of the GTA. Yeah. A field would be plowed, and then archaeologists would walk across it, very similar to a forensic investigation. We space ourselves at a distance so that there's a little bit of overlap, and we just walk back and forth through the fields. And what happens is the plowing will kick artifacts up onto the surface. So if we find artifacts on the surface, we know that there's probably a site there. So we map that area out, and then we will go back and carry out some sampling excavations, putting in what we call units, which are basically square holes that are about a meter wide and a meter long, you know, nice little regular, everything's mapped, everything's gridded using GPS and so forth now. And we would check to see if there's more artifacts there. If there are more artifacts, then we would do more digging. We do more excavation until we've either collected and recorded the entire archaeological site, or depending on its significance, hopefully the site can be saved from development.
Do you use, I mean, sorry, the romance and the time team fan jumps in my head. The tools that would be at a disposal for an archaeologist, I imagine they've evolved over time too, but ground penetrating radar, I mean, I hear things of terms, and although I have a little bit of a working knowledge with them, maybe many of our viewers do not, but phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, like what do they mean from a process perspective?
Right. So, so the province strictly regulates how archaeology is done in the province if you're doing the CRM archaeology in terms of it happening in a development context. So as I said at the beginning, I'm a licensed archaeologist. It's a legal requirement to carry a license in good standing to conduct any type of archaeological investigation in the province. And that's because archaeology is a protected resource. So you have to have expertise in order to carry out any excavation or investigation. And generally the regulations and the rules around how archaeology is done, it's broken down into 4 stages. So the stage 1 is your background study, where an archaeologist looks at a property and we look at old maps. You know, we look at, are there any sites in and around it? We look at the landscape like I talked about before and the way that it's changed over time. Are there any relic water courses that don't have water in it anymore? But all that has been mapped systematically over the years. And there's a wealth of knowledge and mapping and so forth that we use to determine what we call the potential. What's the potential for finding an archaeological site on this property? If we determine that there is potential to find a site, we move to stage 2, which is then actually physically going out and looking for it, like I was saying. And so we walk a field. If the property doesn't have fields, we actually dig what's called a test pit, and they're about 1 foot wide and 1 foot deep. And we take all the soil that comes out of that pit and pass it through a screen and check for artifacts. And we dig one of those every 5 meters across the landscape. So that can be very time consuming,
That sounds like
but it's very thorough. It's a very thorough way of checking to see if there's anything there. If we find something, we go to a stage 3, which is the site-specific investigation. We found artifacts. We need to understand whether or not they have significance, whether or not this is a site that needs further investigation. So we go out and we sample the site and we check to see what we're finding. And that's a crucial stage, because under the law, that's when we have to talk to Indigenous communities. Now, ideally, we're talking to Indigenous communities at the very beginning of this process, and that's something that that's happening with more and more frequency. But right now, under the law, if you find an Indigenous site at stage 3, you are required to engage with the nearest Indigenous communities, find out their interest, They can provide input. They can they might want to discuss the site. They might want to see it protected. And so we start through the process of making sure that we're talking to the people who have cultural relevance to these sites.
Right.
You know, it's not archaeologists making decisions about Indigenous history without talking to the Indigenous communities.
Sorry, John. How do you determine? I mean, we're within the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I'm assuming that's a starting point from a conversation perspective, but you've referenced also layers of history that predate the Mississaugas' involvement. So how do you determine who do you talk to and what the process is for that?
That can be a really tricky process. In Mississauga, absolutely, we're within the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, but also other groups like the Mississaugas of the Scugog Island and so forth. However, the Mississaugas or the Anishinaabe people, which is the larger group that the Mississaugas belong to, they typically, they recognize this area as under the purview of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And so we have a really, the city has a wonderful relationship with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We talk to them almost weekly about all sorts of initiatives and programs and so forth, but we talk a lot about archaeology. And so that's our starting point. But we also recognize that in history, the Haudenosaunee people also occupied this area for a period of time. And before that, the ancestral Huron-Wendat people also occupied Mississauga. So we recognize this in the archaeological record that these people have also lived in Mississauga. So we always try to talk to all the groups simultaneously. It's important that we talk to all the communities. And so we will engage with the Haudenosaunee, we will engage with the Huron-Wendat. And if there's another group that comes forward that wants to be engaged on these projects, we will engage with them as well. But that's typically, and that changes depending on where you are in the province. You may deal with, in some cases, you may deal with other Ojibwe groups, other Anishinaabe groups, other Haudenosaunee groups. You may deal with up to 12 to 20 different Indigenous communities on a single project.
Right.
There's actually, there's 24 identified First Nations that have traditional territory or treaty rights that cover Mississauga. So wow. we could talk to all 24 communities if they're interested.
Right. Now, I may jump ahead, and I know we're going to cover probably a lot of different topics here, but in the question we had was also about if remains are found, if a body were to be found. And I know there's examples of that happening before. We even have some old newspaper clippings of things like that happening in the past. But I think this would segue into what you're talking about. You're going to talk to the groups that are most appropriate for whatever thing has been found, or all the groups. What happens to something, and maybe not just remains, maybe this the artifacts themselves outside of human remains. Like, well, what happens to these things?
So right now the process is that a licensed archaeologist has to hold all artifacts that they excavate in trust for the people of Ontario, and can only be ordered to relinquish them by order of the Crown, which is the provincial government.
Okay.
So archaeologists that have been practicing for 30, 40 years may have basements and garages absolutely chock-a-block full of artifacts. Where possible, we try and grant them back to local museums, or even the National Museum in Ottawa, or the Royal Ontario Museum. There are facilities in Hamilton and London that are known as sustainable archaeology, okay, and they act as repositories for all these artifacts. So they can be transferred to these repositories,
right,
who will take over the care and stewardship of these artifacts. But there's costs associated with that, and so either those are borne by the archaeologists, more ideally they're borne by the developers. But those repositories are fairly recent. They've only been around for the last 5 to 8 years or so. So before then, archaeologists were responsible for storing them all themselves. This is a contentious issue because Indigenous groups very much want their artifacts back. It's their history, and there's been no end of discussion about this in the media and everywhere about the fact that the totem poles in the Royal Ontario Museum being put on display. It's a person's culture that's being put on display, and sometimes with absolutely no cultural sensitivity. So a lot of care has to be taken into what artifacts get put on display these days. And these are, and some Indigenous groups view these artifacts as their ancestors because it's the only remains that they have of their ancestors. And so these become sacred objects. And this is something that, is always under consideration and is one of those evolving topics where hopefully we can see a way that artifacts can be repatriated or reburied in some way that's befitting the cultures that they represent.
And how are within that realm, and because that I knew of it, but it's still a baffling concept of the scope of collections over decades that must have been collected. But what happens with human remains?
Human remains are even more of a challenge. There's various different pieces of legislation in Ontario that cover human remains. The Funeral, Burial, and Cremation Services Act actually trumps all other forms of legislation on this. And as I said, archaeology in general is protected. So you have to have a license, and there are conditions in the Ontario Heritage Act that say that if you knowingly disturb an archaeological site, it's punishable by fines and imprisonment. That being said, if you ever find an archaeological site, if you're walking, if you're trekking along the Credit or something, and you find an arrowhead and you pick it up because you're curious, that's okay. It's okay to be curious about this, but what we always encourage people to do is report it. So report it to Heritage Mississauga, report it to myself at the city, report it to one of the museums in the city. And what we do is I would come out and actually record where you found it and make sure that it's properly recorded, because the province maintains a database of every single archaeological site in the entire province. But getting back to human remains, it is highly illegal to mess with human remains of any kind. And actually, if human remains are found and they aren't considered part of an active police investigation, then there's only 2 types of people in the province that can actually come and deal with them. And one is licensed archaeologists, and the other one is undertakers. So those are the only 2 professions that can legally handle human remains. So if we're digging a site and we've come across human remains, by law we're required to stop all work and contact the local police authority. They would send out homicide detectives and a coroner and determine whether or not this is there was foul play, and if it's considered to be part of a murder investigation or a homicide investigation. Because we're finding them on archaeological sites, they fairly quickly come to the realization that no, this is not part of if it's a homicide investigation, it's maybe a 500-year-old homicide investigation, and they don't have jurisdiction. So they will release the site back to the archaeologist, and then the archaeologist will work with the chief coroner for the province, who will carry out investigations and work with the registrar of burial sites, irregular burials, and war burials for the province of Ontario. And absolutely, if it's an Indigenous burial, all the Indigenous groups are informed. And then we get into a disposition where we need to figure out how many burials there are, because sometimes we just find an isolated burial, sometimes it's a cemetery. Sometimes it's something that's called an ossuary, which is when people moved on from villages, they would carry out what's known as a feast of the dead. And they would, during the life of the village, and a village would last a couple of generations, so anywhere from 20 to 60 years of occupation before they would have to move on because they've taxed the soil from agricultural use and so forth, and they're out of resources. So they would rebuild the village a couple of kilometers upstream. But what they would do is they would have taken all their ancestors who passed and exhumed them from the cemetery and rebury them all in a communal pit. And so sometimes you end up with up to 300, sometimes 500 people.
Wow.
That are all commingled in this large pit that's buried there. And those are found nearby to a lot of village sites all across southern Ontario. Highly sacred, highly important sites that we don't want to impact. So when we find sites like that, we want to do as little investigation as possible because we don't want to disturb anything. And the goal with human remains is that they always remain undisturbed, that they aren't moved. So if we're in an area that's going to be part of a subdivision, we have to start looking at redesigning the subdivision in order to keep those people buried there, because they were buried there for a reason, right, and for a purpose. And occasionally, through the negotiations, they are moved. Sometimes they're moved to a burial site that Indigenous communities have pre-selected. Sometimes, depending on the size of the burial area, an area is set aside within the subdivision. So the burials are temporarily exhumed, only to be reburied closer together in an area that can be protected. Right. But remain within close proximity to where they were buried. And then the ideal is always that there's no exhumation whatsoever and the burials remain where they are. So in cases like that, you know, the areas would become registered burial sites, or if there's enough of burials, they would become registered cemeteries. They would get all the protection of cemeteries have. You can't go digging in there and so forth. There's lots of cases of that. If you're driving through subdivisions and you see a weird empty lot where there's no house, chances are the burials were found and that they're being protected there. Okay.
But and maybe we can use this as a segue to get into a kind of a second part, but those kind of things, they're not readily identifiable or identified either. You don't want to draw attention to a site or to a protected location. So even though things are set aside, it's not part of, say, the public discourse in terms of what's identifiable on the landscape. Is that fair to say? And
absolutely, because archaeology is protected, and because burial sites especially are protected places, there's we tend not to disclose their location at all, because we want to make sure that people don't go in and, well, mess around with them, right? They're protected for a reason. We want to keep them remaining as in situ, as undisturbed as possible. So in cases where we do identify sites and we want to retain them, we go through a rigorous process, typically of what's called capping, which is where we put down layers of different materials, rock, sometimes chain link fence that's laid down, and multiple feet of soil, so that it basically, you would not be able to access the site or the burials without using a giant excavator. It would just be impossible to go in and dig a shovel in.
Literally layers of protection.
layers of physical protection as well as legal protection, and you know, so that they're protected as best as possible, because we don't want people messing around with those sites at all. You know, it's wonderful that people are curious about archaeology. It's an amazing topic, and absolutely, as I said before, if you happen to find something when you're going for a walk, I won't deny that people are allowed to be curious about that, but you always have to pay attention to the fact that even what you think is a utilitarian arrowhead or spear point or something could be a sacred object. And so you have to treat that with respect, and always please notify an authority so that it can be properly recorded. Because again, sometimes it's an unknown site. It's something that nobody's ever found before, or it's part of a protected site that's, you know, people have created trails through woodlots and so forth over time, and the site has started to erode out.
I know a lot of what we focused on, and also because of the question itself, we focused on Indigenous archaeology. It's not just Indigenous, though, of course. I mean, there are thousands of years people have interacted with this landscape, and it's multiple generations. You discussed in great detail the different eras, if you will, of Indigenous connections to this landscape of different cultural groups and whatnot. But we also delve into that hybrid period between Indigenous people and European settlement taking place. And so there's those remnants that are left behind on our landscape too.
And that's actually some of Mississauga's richest archaeological resources, because the Mississaugas of the Credit lived at the Credit River Indian Mission, which is located underneath the Mississauga Golf Club. And we know that it's there. There is a registered archaeological site there. There have been remnants of that mission found when some minor excavations occurred about 10 years ago in the golf club. We do know that historically, as settlers and colonists began to move into this area, Indigenous people continued to live here, and they coexisted. There's parts of Port Credit that is known as the storefront along the wharf of the Credit Indigenous peoples, and mixed along with storefronts and warehouses and so forth of early European settlers and so forth that set up what became Port Credit today. And then slowly over time, and I believe you talked about this in a recent talk about the treaties and the process of land purchases and so forth, as the Indigenous groups and the Indigenous communities were moved off the landscape, and the area was given up for more, settler farming and so forth. We start to get these early settlements, the Streetsvilles, the Cooksvilles, the Clarksons, and so forth. And then all these farms that were all spread out across the landscape. The Crown patent that was set out was always for 200 acres, which is a very large piece of land to set up as a farm. And each one of these farms had a little farmhouse. Some of them started off as little log cabins, and then eventually grew into a frame house or a brick house, a several-story brick house. It was. And that's also what we look at in archaeology. We will investigate those early settlement areas. We will investigate those early settlements because that's an important story as well.
Right.
And that's a critical part of understanding the history of Canada, the history of Mississauga. It's just another aspect of it.
But I guess I kind of, in a leading sense, where I was going with that question is, they are treated the same from an archaeologist's perspective, right? The process is the same process regardless of the era. That's more of a question than a statement, I think.
Well, you're absolutely correct. We call those historic Euro-Canadian sites, and that's a bit of a misnomer in and of itself, because it encapsulates a very specific type of history. And one of the things that we as archaeologists deal with, especially given the conversations that are happening today around Black Lives Matter and understanding the place of race in history, is that it wasn't just white settlers. There were all sorts of different people that came and inhabited in Mississauga. And so the trick is not just focusing on white settlement during that period, but looking at all the different types of settlement that occurred, be they Indigenous, be they Black, be they Asian, be they Nordic, be they British, whoever it was that settled here. They all have their own unique stories, and they're all deserving of the same identification and respect that's given regardless of what their background is when it comes to their archaeology, to their remains.
I know I've always used the term that we don't live in a bubble today. There's a constant interaction and interplay on the people that live on the landscape, and cross space, cross cultures, however terminology you want to do it. There's no bubble that exists around a certain culture and a certain people, and that wasn't the case historically either. People interacted, whether you were Indigenous or an early settler or a British officer or a politician. The interactions were there, and they lived in a world that was dynamic, and information may have traveled a little more slowly than it does today, but it still traveled.
Exactly. And that's just it. there's always more stories to find. And what we do in archaeology now is we try and figure out, as you alluded to ground penetrating radar, and we use different types of processes that are known as geophysical surveys, and that's a way of seeing what's in the ground without having to dig. And you can find minute traces of past human occupation using that kind of technology. And so what we're getting is a much more fulsome account of what human history is left in the soil,
Right.
And making sure that that's recorded and retained, and so that it's not just lost as the city continues to grow. Cities grow, and it's an important part of a vibrant city is that there continues to be growth, but not at the cost of history. So it's a continual evolution within the discipline of how are we going to record as much as we possibly can, before we lose it.
And for people to learn more, and I don't mean as a kind of a self a book published by Heritage Mississauga, but really just a book of great resources. Mississauga, the first 10,000 years. It has a couple of stories in there on sites that were fully excavated, but also no longer remain due to development. And so, namely the Antrex and Scott O'Brien site. And we don't need to spend time delving into the sites. I mean, if the book is there, if people want to read more about them. But to learn more about some of these sites, in a way, can they become public once they are no longer? Does that make sense? Like, I understand the idea of needing to protect them and to hide them in plain sight. I don't know what the right terminology is, but you don't showcase what is preserved and what is protected. But there are those sites that get lost under developments and highway widenings and the like. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, no, I understand. What we do is in cases like that is that we tell the stories of the sites, because the thing about a site is where there's one, there's always more. And so we always want to make sure that we never release too much information, because there are people that do go out and knowingly go into these sites. They aren't archaeologists. They don't necessarily, it's not that they don't have the expertise. A lot of them carry out the same types of excavations as an archaeologist, but they do it in order to sell artifacts. They do it for their own reasons and not for anyone's benefit, except their own.
Right.
So, but what we do is we tell the stories. If a site's been totally excavated, it's a lot safer to talk about it, and so we try to tell those stories as much as possible. And so, yeah, the book is a great resource. I'd encourage people to look up the Ontario Archaeological Society. It's on Facebook. It's got websites, and it's got full descriptions of the types of sites that you find in Ontario and the types of artifacts and so forth. It's a really good resource. Next year, the city is planning on running some archaeology programming. Hopefully, if people can get together next year, then we can run them anyway. So that's something that we're very much looking forward to.
Oh, I'd be excited about that. That sounds like a really fun thing.
Yeah. So, again, if people have any questions about archaeology, if they find something and they're curious about it, even if they found it 10 years ago, even if they found it, what often happens, the questions I get asked a lot of is that when they're, when their grandparents pass away, they find a shoebox full of arrowheads or something up in the attic, and they have questions about that. By all means, they can contact me. My contact information is on the city website. It's also just my name and at mississauga.ca. Send me some pictures.
Or contact us and I'll send it to them.
Yeah, send it to Heritage Mississauga, even better. But
I can put people in touch with John.
But by all means, get in touch with us. Get in touch with Matthew or I, and we'd be happy to take a look at what you found and let you know how to deal with it properly.
Well, John, you are an incredible wealth of information and knowledge, and the passion comes through. And I think our resources, from a guidance perspective, I was gonna say you're not always on the ground now, but I have evidence that you are because you were in the pit last year. So
I try and get out as much as I can. Yeah.
yeah, I'm sure the passion doesn't leave you, and I feel like we are in good hands with the city in terms of understanding these layers of our past and how we, I guess, interact with them as the city grows, and how we protect them and ultimately learn from them and share some of those stories. And so, thank you for that. Thank you for the information today. That was an incredible wealth. And back to Chris's question at the beginning, hopefully that has answered your question and more, and perhaps left you wanting some more. And if you have any other questions, shoot back with us, and hopefully we can answer some of those. But thank you very much, John, for the time, for the passion, and for the incredible knowledge you've shared with us. Really appreciate the support of that and your direction therein. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure as always.
Awesome.
Thank you, Andrew, for submitting your question to Ask a Historian. And you're asking about the hydro corridor in the Clarkson and Lorne Park areas and beyond. A fascinating element of our story, and some that kind of goes kind of hidden in plain sight, if you will. This element of our landscape. The hydro corridor itself was established between 1903 and 1927. The property, the right of way, was acquired in, I guess, not in partnership, but in sequence by first the Toronto and Niagara Power Company and then the Hydroelectric Power Company of Ontario to create that swath across what is now the city of Mississauga. As such, given its date of origin, it's been part of Mississauga's landscape for generations. Your question was specifically, I guess, where does it go and where does it come from? To start with where it comes from, the electricity along this line is transmitted as part of a larger Ontario grid. It's part of a much larger network of electrical power within the province. But specifically, this comes from the Sir Adam Beck hydroelectric generating stations near Niagara Falls. And the corridor brings power into Toronto and beyond, crossing Mississauga and kind of that diagonal swath starting down in the southwest corner in Clarkson, and angling up through the city, crossing the Credit River, and then running parallel to the Queensway alignment. The destination of it, if you will, or the next stopping place for it, is the transformer substation, the A.W. Manby Transformer Substation at 850 Kipling Avenue in Etobicoke. And from there, the line spreads out and services much larger portions of the city of Toronto and beyond. But it is part of a much larger electrical power generation grid that serves the province. As for its main sources for electricity across the province, Mississauga, of course, does not stand alone. We are tied to the provincial power grid, and Ontario has a diverse grid of electricity sources. According to the National Energy Board in 2017, our sources for electricity include 58% through nuclear power, 24% through water power, 8% through wind power, 6% through natural gas, 2.5% through solar, 0.5% through bioenergy, and other is listed as 0.8%. So you can see we're quite a diverse range, of which hydroelectricity amounts to just 24%. I guess it's still a significant portion of our power. That is of 2017, as posted by the National Energy Board. So quite a broad range, and what we have in Mississauga is a portion of that transmission infrastructure that allows power to be transmitted from Niagara Falls into the heartland around what is now the city of Toronto, and of course Mississauga is tied to that as well. But again, thank you for your question. It is a fascinating element of our landscape, and one that we perhaps don't often think about when we turn the light switch on, is how does it get here? And again, thank you for that, and we could explore the history of power generation perhaps in another episode, but again, thank you very much, and look forward to exploring more history with you.